Hey guys, Katie here. If this is your first time on the channel, welcome. I'm a hobbyist game developer making a life sim bird game in Godot. I'm documenting my development of this game on this channel, as well as sharing any tips and tricks I learn along the way. Today I wanted to show you guys how I implemented item resources in my game. Going into developing this feature, I knew I wanted to use custom resources to define all of the items I was going to have in the game. If you're unfamiliar with custom resources, I highly recommend learning more about them, as they allow you to define your game's data in a very organized and extendable way. I won't fully dive into what resources are in this video, but I'll link some resources on resources in the description that really helped me. Within my custom item resource, I have a mesh variable that I store the 3D mesh for that object in. This worked great, but since I want these items to actually exist in my game world, they need collision shapes so they don't just fall through the ground, and so the character can actually interact with them. This had me stuck thinking for a bit because resources can only hold other resources. They can't hold, for example, a rigid body that is derived from the node class. So I couldn't, instead of a mesh, store a rigid body scene with the mesh and collision shape in it. I could try to put a collision shape in as a value in my resource, but this would be tedious to create and match the collision shape to the mesh, and I would have to do that for every object in my game, so I didn't think that was a viable option. The solution I arrived at is actually generating a collision shape in my code based on the mesh in my resource when the object is loaded into the game. And now I'll show you how I did that. Okay, let's take a look at the code in Godot. So here is my item resource class that's extended from the base resource. And the important part here is that it's taking in a mesh. So you can see over here an example of a item resource I made for a stick. And I've just dragged in this mesh that hopefully looks like a stick, not a piece of poop. It's a stick, I swear. And we have the other variables set up here. The collision buffer and isSimpleCollision are related to generating the collision shape, but we'll get a little more into what these variables do later. So how do we get from this resource file to an actual item in the game world? Well, I'm doing that through the item object scene. So let's take a look at what the scene looks like. It looks like absolutely nothing. Yay! But that's fine. It looks like nothing because we're gonna generate everything in the code. So the root object here is a rigid body 3D. And then underneath that, we've got a mesh instance 3D and a collision shape 3D. And you'll notice here that this even has a little warning. That's fine. We're gonna set up the shape in the code. And let's take a look at the code. Okay, so this is the item object class. It takes in an item resource through this exported variable. So you can simply drag in an item resource file into an item object, and then bam, you got your object. So when this item object is added to the scene tree, it runs this load item method. The first thing it does is it sets up the mesh. So it takes the mesh out of the item resource and puts it in the mesh instance. And then this is where the magic happens. This is where we are actually generating that collision shape that this collision shape 3D desperately wants. We're giving it to it. And in my game, I actually wanted to have two different types of collisions. Simple collisions and then more complex collision shapes. Because for something like the stick I showed earlier, I don't really need anything more complex than just a box surrounding the mesh. So to create a simple collision shape, I'm first getting the bounding box of the mesh. And I'm getting that through this getAABB function. Now this function eluded me for a while because I kept glossing over it because I was like, what the heck is an AABB? Well, if you take a look at the documentation, you can see that this is basically like a bounding box that encloses the mesh. And actually, if you're ever looking at like a 3D view of something, and you'll notice this orange box surrounding the mesh, this is the AAB. So from that, you can see how we can kind of generate that simple collision shape that we want. So we can't just set what we get from this getAABB function into the collision shape. And that's because it's returning an AABB object, not a shape. And what we need is a shape. But doing that conversion is pretty easy. I'm just creating a new box shape and then setting the size of it to the same size as this bounding box. And then this part is optional. This is just because I wanted a little bit more wiggle room in case a certain mesh needed a larger collision shape than the size of the actual mesh. So this just lets you set a variable, the collision buffer, within the item resource in case you wanted that collision shape to be larger. But again, not necessary, and I actually haven't used it yet, but I feel like it might come in handy. And then lastly, I'm changing the position, not of this collision shape we just made, but of this actual collision shape 3D node that we have in the scene tree up here. And the reason why we have to do this is because, well, at least for my meshes, I have the origin at the bottom of the mesh. So when we create the collision shape, it's actually going to be centered around the bottom. So here I'm just shifting it up by half. So it actually encompasses the mesh instead of hanging out at the bottom. Okay, so that's great for a simple collision shape. But what if you have something more complex than a stick? What if you have, for example, a nest? So you can see here my nest resource. Since a simple box isn't going to work for this shape, there's actually a very handy method within the mesh class to create a convex shape. So this will actually wrap the mesh in a polygonal shape that like clings to the surface of the mesh. And then finally, just setting the shape that we made, either the simple or complex one, to this collision shape 3D node. Okay, so let's take a look at what these items look like in the game. So I'm going to add 2 item object scenes to my main scene. And I'll have this one be the stick. And I'll have another item object. But I want that in the main. And this will be the nest item object. Okay. And then we'll need to give it the resources it needs. So stick, drag the stick resource in there. And then for the nest, drag the nest in there. And let's see, let's go to 3D view. Let's just move the stick over here so we can actually see both of them. Okay, And then if we run the game, wow. We've got our simple collision shape on the stick. It's just a box that's surrounding it. And then you can see for the nest, it's a much more complex shape that's actually wrapping the nest. And kind of seems like my nest is a little unstable here. It's kind of teetering. So one thing you might be asking yourself is, why not make everything this convex shape and get rid of this code? You can do that, and depending on what sort of items are in your game, maybe that makes sense. But I decided to have these separate ones because if you look into the documentation, and let's drill down to what is a convex polygon shape 3D. There's this performance section here, and it says here its use should generally be limited to medium-sized objects that cannot have their collision shape accurately represented by primitive shapes. It is faster than, say, like a concave polygon shape 3D, but it's not as fast as the primitive shapes, like box shape. So if you went with convex polygon shapes for everything, you might run into some performance issues. Okay, that's all I have for today. I hope this helped some of y'all. I didn't see any tutorials on this when I was trying to implement it, or at least I wasn't Googling the right stuff. So hopefully if you stumbled across this, it answered your questions or maybe gave you some ideas of how to implement something similar in your game. Please like and subscribe, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask them down below. I'll see you next time. Bye!